of experimental subjects that we know absolutely nothing about. Occasionally, a name will pop up where somebody will admit that they were a subject in an MK-Ultra experiment, or somebody else will mention it. And at times the names that pop up can be pretty startling. The Unabomber, Ted Kwiecinski, I don't know if you're aware of him or not.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But he was a subject in LSD experiments that were conducted at Harvard University. And all that I was able to garner in terms of information about what he was exposed to is, yes, he was a subject in a LSD experiment that was conducted at Harvard by a very respected psychologist, Dr. Henry Murray. But beyond that, we know nothing. And oftentimes, these experiments were conducted in tandem with hypnosis, with other drugs, with other mind control techniques, and it really leaves one to wonder, in the case of Kwiecinski and others, what really did happen, and how many people like Kwiecinski are out there, and their actions might be attributed to the fact that they were MK-Ultra subjects.
Yeah.
It really begs the issue and poses the question largely.
That's just incredible. Yeah, there's so many of these, and again, he was another doctor, as it were, the Kaczynski, the Unabomber, as is known as, assistant professor at the University of California in Berkeley again. When you refer to these, the narcotics farm that you mentioned in Lexington, William Burroughs being one of these as well, subjects, were they unwittingly given LSD, or did they know what they were given? Do you know if that's the case?
Well, that's an issue that's still debated today, and I'll tell you what side I come down on that, because I just had this conversation with an Army psychiatrist who had been on the giving end of LSD experiments for the Army, and what people were told in the early 50s, and actually right through to the late 50s and early 60s, was that they were being given an experimental drug. If anyone had been told they were going to be given LSD, they wouldn't know what that meant anyway. Very few people in the early 50s knew what LSD was. There was maybe anywhere from 5 to 10 physicians in the United States that understood what the drug was. There were probably more in Europe that were more familiar with the drug, because the Sandoz Chemical Company initially worked closely with a number of European doctors. But what people were told was that they were going to be given an experimental drug, that possibly it was in the process of being approved by the Food and Drug Administration of the United States government, and that they might expect to feel some odd or peculiar effects from the drug, but they certainly weren't told. They weren't given the full gamut of possible effects. They weren't told that, given the amount of the dosage, that you could have anywhere from mild to very severe hallucinations and possibly lose touch with reality. And oftentimes, the so-called volunteers, the Army called them volunteers, there were inducements that went along with getting people to volunteer. In other words, they were given liberal passes, allowed to go home. The servicemen were allowed to go home more often, or they could go on weekend leaves. In the case, and this is really remarkable, in the case of the men at the Lexington narcotics farm, initially when a few men volunteered for the LSD experiments, they had what they considered to be a very bad reaction. And so they went back and they told the other patients or inmates there, they said, hey, don't volunteer to take this drug, because it's just not, it's not a pleasurable experience at all. And so initially they were having a hard time getting patients to volunteer. So unbelievably, they offered, in return for people to volunteer, they offered heroin in exchange for volunteering for the LSD experiments. Now that's highly, highly unethical. I mean, these people, are committed to a rehabilitation facility rather than going to prison, and they go there to clean up, to hopefully break their addiction and rejoin society, free and clean without addictions. Yet, in order to induce some of these men to participate in the experiments, they were actually given heroin in exchange, and that went on for several years. And it made a mockery of the rehabilitative aspects of the facility. With the case of the Army volunteers, I mentioned that I've been communicating with this former Army psychiatrist. He says he makes a point that everybody volunteered and that they were told the truth. But again, the truth was, it's a new drug. We're testing the effects. We really don't understand the effects, and nobody was very blunt or frank or honest with a number of the subjects. In the case of the Army, with Edgewood Arsenal alone, and these were experiments that were conducted without the cooperation of the CIA. They experimented on 5,700 servicemen. Now, some of those servicemen, maybe a third or more, were given a placebo, but that still leaves a very high number of servicemen that were given LSD, and the records show that in some cases these doses were fairly small, but in other cases they were extremely large, far larger than anyone would take for a recreational trip or experience, and in some cases, large enough where it would be enough of the drug that would serve 3 or 4 people, and so, as expected, a lot of these men had bad reactions to the drug.
Yeah.
And there was in the Army, because of these reactions and because of the adverse publicity that eventually came out in the late 70s, the Army tried to do follow-up studies with men, and they sent allegedly they sent a letter to each man who had been given LSD, but I think only about 40% of the men responded affirmatively to take part in the follow-up study, and it went on for almost a year, and then it seems to just have fallen apart. But the few documents that have emerged from the follow-up study showed that, at least in my view, there was a fair amount of damage that was done to some of these people. There was, a large percentage of attempted suicides. There were some actual suicides, and then there was a lot of problems, just psychological problems, of people blacking out, having flashbacks, or having psychotic episodes that they wouldn't remember. And normally you wouldn't get that from taking LSD once or twice. But I think what had happened is that some of these men took it multiple times, probably not, without much, spacing between it, and psychologically weren't equipped for what the effects were.
Yeah, of course. Do you know if this was or during what time period this is? Because I'm thinking about this the quote that you have in the beginning of the book, or in terms of what Richard Helms, the CIA deputy director, said to the director John McCone back in '63. He said, "Since we strongly believe that without testing of unwitting